Good evening. 100 years ago, a group of politicians in Ottoman Turkey with violent ideas decided to exterminate a whole race. Their plan became the start of the first genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide. This led Mr. Raphael Lemkin, 28 years later, to name this atrocity act a genocide. 100 years have passed, and I, a fourth-generation genocide survivor, am standing here in front of hundreds of human rights activists to shed light on the prevention of all genocides. The perpetrators clearly failed. In the course of those 100 years, however, millions of victims have perished due to similar atrocities. Hitler had exterminated 6 million Jews while the world stayed silent. Similar murderers felt comfortable enough to organize genocide in Ukraine, Rwanda, Sudan, Cambodia, and others. But why? Because the perpetrators from the first genocide of the 20th century have yet to be punished. We failed as well for not stopping the occurring of those similar atrocities. What is most distressing and ironic is that even today, in 2015, 100 years later, the same Turkey is funding the murderous activities happening now in Syria and Iraq. They organized the first genocide, and they are confident that they can successfully get away with these horrible murders as well. The key to genocide prevention is the punishing of the perpetrators of genocides. How can we accept, as civilians of civilized country, to let perpetrators deny that a genocide actually occurred? How can we accept that Turkey has not paid any reparations to the Armenian people? How can we talk about justice when we have forgotten the essence of genocide prevention, recognition, and reparations? Justice is crucial in creating peace and preventing future genocides. I'm extremely honored today to welcome 2 genocide survivors in this room. They represent our hope and story. They represent the voice of wisdom. They are the voice of all genocide victims who have perished throughout the years. They clearly put into shame all genocide murderers. Their presence is a proof that a genocide against any nation is a crime against humanity. We will start today's event by inviting the first genocide survivor on stage. His name is Ted Bulger, and he is a Holocaust survivor. Without further ado, Mr. Ted Bulger.
Good evening. My name is Ted Bulger, and I am a Holocaust survivor. I survived a ghetto, 5 concentration camps, and a death march. Let me start with a quotation. It says, "I have issued a command. I have anybody who utters but one word of criticism will be executed by the firing squad. Our war aim does not consist of reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction of enemy. Accordingly, I have placed my deadhead formation in readiness for the present only in the east, with orders to them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only then shall we gain the living space, the Lebensraum, which we need. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? That was a speech by Hitler in 1938. And he was wrong. Because we are here now, 2015, to commemorate the genocide of the Armenians 100 years ago, and the Holocaust 70 years ago. I can give you numbers: 6 million, 1.5 million. Those were victims. And each of these numbers represent a man, woman, or a child. The Armenians and the Jews have very similarities in their history, starting with persecution. Then we have our own countries, but most of us still lives dispersed all around the world. I am proud to say that wherever we settled, we established strong communities. We managed to keep our language, our religion, and our educational system. Here in Montreal, I had an Armenian bank manager who insisted that it takes 2 Jews to match one Armenian businessman. We will still remain friends. Also in Montreal, we had to give up one of our synagogues, and the Armenians took it over. But even after that, we still had our high holiday prayers in the same building. As I said, Hitler was wrong, because by 1930, a Jewish writer in Austria, his name was Franz Werfer, who wrote a book about the Armenian Genocide. The English title of the book is The 40 Days of Musa Dal. It was well received. It was translated into several languages. Naturally, it was banned in Germany. In the spring of 1944, I was reading this book. Then the Germans came in and put me in a ghetto. So I was going around trying to find someone who finished the book. Finally, a woman said, "Yes, I did." My question was, did they survive? She said, "Yes, 2 French ships came and took them away." So I felt good. During my stay in the concentration camps, sometimes I was thinking of this book and gave me a slight hope. And maybe it even helped me to survive. I have to tell you that I managed to read this book and finish it 15 years later here in Canada in English translation. And when I finished it, I felt that a chapter of my life was finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ted Balger. Now I want to invite the second survivor. She has witnessed the Rwandan genocide, and she wants to share her story with us. Join me in welcoming Mrs. Leontine Umubiei.
Good evening, everyone. So yes, my name is Umubiei Leontine, and yes, I witnessed the Rwandan genocide. Today, Armenians are remembering 100 years. Rwanda is remembering 20 years, and soon 21 years. When genocide began, started in 1994, I was 8 years. Now you can calculate, I'm turning 30 years this year. I was born in a family, we had 6 kids, with a father and a mother. Growing up, I didn't know what I was. I didn't know whether I was a Tutsi or a Hutu. And I knew this in 1994 when I was hiding, running in the forest with my brother and asking, why are we hiding? Why don't we go back to our home? And that's when he told me we're Tutsis and Hutus are chasing us, and if they find us, they'll kill us. So I was the only survivor of my family. So all my 5 siblings were killed, my father, my mother. But I survived. I spent 3 months without food, without water, but I survived. And after genocide, I have hope. I have built new families. I have this one family that I'm the mother of the family. They're just kids like me. We are grown up now. But we met at school, and then we needed to share our stories. And yeah, we have kids. I'm the mother, and they have the father. And together we share our stories. It helps us to move on without forgetting what we went through. And my wish is that my grandkids, in 100 years, I want them to tell this story, but I don't want them to go through what I went through. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our survivors for having shared their painful stories. They were very touching. I would like to start by mentioning that there will be a question-answer period at the end of the 3 speeches, so please keep your questions for the end. It is now to invite on stage the first speaker. Dr. Henry Theriault is currently professor and chair of the philosophy department at Worcester State University in the United States, where he taught since 1998. From 1999 to 2007, he coordinated the university's Center for the Study of Human Rights. His research focuses on reparations, victims, perpetrators' relations, genocide denial, genocide prevention, and mass violence against women and girls. He has published numerous journals, articles, and chapters in the area of genocide studies, including reparations for genocide, group harm, and the limits of liberal. He has lectured and given panel papers around the world, including in Armenia, Turkey, the Mountainous Harappa Republic, Lebanon, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Rwanda, Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, Argentina, and across the United States. He is founding co-editor of the peer-reviewed Genocide Studies International and was recently named co-editor of the Transaction Publishers Genocide, a critical bibliographic review. From 2007 to 2012, he served as co-editor of the Genocide Studies and Prevention, as well as guest editor of the International Criminal Law Review, special issue on Armenian Genocide reparations, and Armenian Review, special issue on the new global reparations movement. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Henry Theriault.
Let me make sure everyone can hear me okay. All right, I'm usually really loud. I probably don't even need this, and you can hear me uncomfortably in the back. I'm really glad I don't have that mic, because I was a little worried I was going to have to do like a music video or something to start off. But this one's a little more my speed. And I really appreciate. This is the first time I've spoken in Canada, actually, from that list. That's the one missing link, and I'm very privileged to be here. And very grateful to the sponsors of this event, starting with the Armenian National Committee of Canada, and especially Arad Tarosian for making my visit possible, as well as the Montreal Holocaust Memorial Center, STAND, Page Rwanda, the Sarah Corning Center for Genocide Education, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, the Ukrainian and Greek Student Associations, the Assyrian, Chaldean, and Syriac Student Union, the McGill, Concordia, and University of Montreal Armenian Student Association, and the Armenian Student Association. Hope I didn't leave anybody out, but I have to find out later from the organizers how you got so many great groups to come together to do this, because where I'm from, we're not so good about doing that. So it's really a testament to the work that you've done. More seriously, I am profoundly humbled to follow Leontine Umabieye, I know I'm mispronouncing it, so I apologize, and Ted Bulgar. Their powerful words really have more meaning than 1,000 scholarly texts, and I think we all appreciate that. And on top of that, finally, I'm entirely unworthy to present my small contributions alongside two giants in genocide and human rights studies and activism, Doctors Payam Akhavan and Frank Chalk. Professor Akhavan, I deeply admire your intellectual and practical work on human rights. What you've done in the international legal arena for victims of mass violence and all of humanity, which is really what this is about, has become legendary, and I have to say it's probably the apex of my professional life to be on the same flyer with you, which I'm going to show to a lot of people after this. And Frank, I have to go on the first name basis because we've known each other for probably further than either of us wants to remember. You are one of the reasons I got into this field in the first place. And your pioneering work, creating the very concept of comparative genocide studies and examining the definition of genocide and much more, has been an inspiration and really continues to guide and inform my work today. And I have to say, I consider opening my new copy of your and Kurt Jonassen's The History and Sociology of Genocide a quarter century ago as one of the fundamentally transformative points in my life. Finally, I want to thank each and every audience member. Surely in the world city of Montreal, there are much more enjoyable things and better things to eat, or wonderful things you could be eating. And yet you have chosen to spend your time here thinking about and discussing one of the most daunting sources of pain and difficult challenges of human existence. You have my deepest respect. There is an oft-repeated false truism about genocide, that denial is the final stage of genocide. It is so unquestionably accepted that it has even made its way into formal stage theories of genocide. It is unfortunately quite wrong. Denial is not the final stage of genocide, but rather present throughout most of the genocidal process. When they are doing it, perpetrators almost inevitably deny that what they are doing is genocide. For instance, Talat and his cronies were adamant that their violence against Armenians was not one-sided mass extermination, but instead a response to Armenian rebellion and violent perfidy in Van and elsewhere. They maintained that the deportations were intended merely to move Armenians to other areas of the empire, not a means of destroying the Armenian population of village after village, town after town. Because of the diffused identity recently analyzed by David Gaunt in a Genocide Studies International article, which I recommend all of you read, as well as the international focus being mostly on Armenians, the genocide perpetrators of the time did not really even need to speak of Assyrians and Greeks. Omission was enough. We see variations on this theme in case after case. The United States, in fact, we can say, did not hunt down Native American groups, did not kill those under their control or force them onto destructive reservations. No, my country fought the so-called savages, that's in quotes by the way, so everyone understands that, in a series of Indian wars, so-called Indian wars. One need only look at the historical record of hyper-violence by the US military and general population against Native Americans, which tortured, raped, killed, and then mutilated these populations to see who the real savages have been. The Tasmanians were killing livestock and even settlers, while the Herero were in revolt. The Jews had a world conspiracy that was out to get decent Aryans in an existential conflict, and it needed to be stopped. Pro-democracy activists in Indonesia were actually a communist attack against the government, while Guatemalan Mayans, who appeared to be decent, hardworking people in dire poverty, just trying to survive the assaults on them by their government, and the rich, were actually communist insurgents determined to destroy the good values of their society and impose a horrible political and social order. The Tutsi were hell-bent on destroying the Hutu, who had no choice but to respond, and the Bosnian Muslims, not the Serbs, were the aggressors, despite the fact that the latter had by far the most military power. Today, the supposed rebellion in the Nuba Mountain and Blue Nile regions of Sudan leave decent guy, and that's also in big quotes, Omar al-Bashir no choice but to bomb tens of thousands of civilians with Antonov aircraft. Denial is not a stage of genocide, but a part of the commission of genocide, especially as prosecutions have led sophisticated perpetrators to begin their international tribunal defenses while the blood is still flowing. Denial is certainly prevalent after genocide as well, as the false truism does capture accurately. It is not a final stage, however. Indeed, as long as denial persists, we can be sure that the genocidal process is still operating. Denial accompanies this operation and furthers its true goal of eliminating the consequences of the genocide for the perpetrator group, even generations and centuries after the violence and destruction. Denial is not the final stage of genocide, consolidation of genocide is. A genocide deeply ruptures the pre-existing status quo, and in particular devastates the victim community. Just because the violence and destruction of genocide ends, or end, does not mean that their consequences are mitigated. On the contrary, so long as the impact of a genocide on its victims remains unrepaired, that impact continues devastating them in perpetuity. Time does not heal the wounds of genocide. On the contrary, as generation follows generation, more and more people are injured, demeaned, and assaulted by the original violence. With each day that passes without repair, the scope of the destruction increases. The end limit point of the process is not successful denial, as many people would think, but the point at which denial is no longer necessary because the genocide's impact has become fully irreparable, as the genocide's consequences have become permanently consolidated in the global, social, political, and economic status quo, and that generally means the disappearance of the victim group. Denial ends not with the success of denial, denial ends not with the success of denial, but the total and complete consolidation of genocide. Genocides are denied because their effects, both material and in terms of historical memory, are thankfully still contested. This is clear through a few more examples. The genocides of the Theriault, Australian Aborigines, Native Canadians, and Native Americans are still denied actively, precisely because the victim groups still experience the impacts of the injuries of direct massacre, religious and cultural destruction, forced transfers of children, internment on reservations, family degradation through boarding schools, and much more. And so a reparative process could actually address these harms. Denial stops reparations. Denial of the Holocaust continues because the evils of anti-Semitism that it maximized horrifically remain vibrant forces in human society across the globe. The Holocaust persists through its legacy of making Jews, already considered fit targets of oppression and violence before it, the fit targets of mass extermination. Denials of the Bangladesh, East Timor, Cambodian, and other cases continue because perpetrators and survivors yet live, and the deep harm done to each society remains largely unaddressed. The list of denied genocides go on. No one denies the genocides of Melos and Carthage, of the Cathars, or by Genghis Khan, because the destruction they imparted into the world has long since been completely and irreparably incorporated into the world order. For these and all too many other genocides, utterly and completely getting away with it has been the final stage. How many so-called great societies and states celebrated in the present and past are so because of their great success in consolidating the genocides they committed and receiving historical exoneration? The false truism reflects an important effect of denial. Years of denial after a genocide actually skew the framework through which that genocide is perceived and understood. Faced with a strong denial campaign, survivors and concerned others, including in the perpetrator group, those decent people who try to get the historical record right, find themselves in a seemingly endless, disheartening, degrading, and exhausting struggle simply to get the truth recognized by enough people that it will not be erased from the annals of human history. Soon enough, the genocide itself is lost in the struggle against denial, which becomes an end in itself. The defeat of denial under such circumstances comes to be seen as justice for the genocide. Defeated or not, in this case, denial wins the day. By preventing us from seeing that the defeat of denial does not give us justice, but merely gets us back to the starting point from which we can finally initiate a justice process. For long past genocides, victim groups and others forget that recognition of the genocide against denial does not repair the harms done by genocide, but merely addresses a secondary problem. Only by directly and substantially engaging those harms through a comprehensive reparations process can the world do what it can to bring justice to the victim group and all of humanity. With this in mind, it is clear that 2015, the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the Syrian Genocide, and actually the Greek process started maybe a year or two earlier, should not be understood as a culminating point in the post-genocide history of the Ottoman genocide of the Christian minority groups. If recognition comes this year, as it could, though I'm not holding my breath to be perfectly honest, it will mean only that finally, after a century, the victim groups and others concerned with human rights can finally start addressing the original harms done. The meaning of 100 years, to be perfectly honest, really is just about the number of fingers that we have. There's nothing essential about that passage of time. And in the process of genocide, the effects of genocide happen through an ongoing process where they may reach a culmination in 122 years or 75 years or some other odd number. And if we load too much meaning into that 100th anniversary, we risk not really addressing the genocide in this case as well as we should. What are the harms of genocide? My work is focused on the Armenian case. If you'll permit me a short commercial interruption, since 2007, I have chaired the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group and worked with renowned international lawyer and legal scholar Alfred Desaias, former Armenian ambassador to Canada, Ara Papian, and dynamic Jamaican political scientist Jermaine McAlpin, to produce a comprehensive study of reparations for the Armenian Genocide. The report analyzes the harms done and the legal, historical, and ethical justifications for repair, and then proposes an innovative transitional justice process to effect that reparations process. The report includes determinations of territorial and other restitution that should be made by Turkey, and a discussion of the ways in which reparations should be used by Armenian people and the Armenian group as a whole to ensure the future viability of its state and global identity. The summary of our report has been available since last fall at www, told you it was a commercial interruption, .armeniangenocidereparations.info. And our full 90,000 word report is currently being typeset for electronic and print distribution in English and Armenian, and I think there's plans for French as well as possibly Turkish, and will be posted on the website very shortly. The harms done by the Armenian Genocide are very much present today. They include the dramatic demographic impact on the Armenian population through direct and indirect killing, as well as forced assimilation that reduced the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire to less than 40% of its pre-genocide number, but also the compounding impact on birth rates and retention of members by rape and other torture, rampant poverty, long-term effects of malnutrition, global dispersion, loss of religious, educational, and other institutions necessary for the cohesion of Armenian communities, and much more. To these harms are added the extensive lost property of Armenians. Not only were virtually all land, businesses, farm, warehouse inventories, food stocks, and other such properties taken from Armenians, but the mass expropriation reached down to the most trivial items, from kitchen pots and pans to the clothes on deportees' backs and the shoes on their feet. Turkish activist and writer Temel Demirer has stated that this mass theft, that it was with this Armenian property that the entire economy of the new 1923 Turkish Republic was founded. What is more, since this time, Armenians have lost all that would have been built with these material resources, a loss that compounds daily, with many living out their lives over the past century impoverished because denied what was theirs. And these massive material resources have not just disappeared. Wealthy Turkish families, the government, and average people have received the cumulative benefits of all that this wealth has allowed them to build. Again, it's daily interest compounding. In fact, scholars such as Ugur Ungur and Mehmet Politel have traced expropriated Armenian property through to contemporary national and regional elite families, very specific properties, businesses, and so forth, some of whose family fortunes were built with the property pilfered from exterminated Armenians. The destruction of religious, educational, cultural, and artistic and other aspects of Armenian communal existence, coupled with the demographic collapse and global dispersion, have rendered Armenian identity and peoplehood fragile despite heroic efforts from community members, requiring continual draining efforts just to prevent its erasure. The demographic destruction and individual as well as state territorial expropriations of the 1915 to 1923 period are the most important factor in the reality that today's Armenian Republic is a small landlocked country of barely 3 million people facing a gigantic, economically and militarily powerful and hostile Turkey of 70 million, a Turkey that enjoys tremendous regional power and geopolitical prominence that allows it nearly free reign in its treatment of the Armenian Republic. Even had the genocide occurred, but Ataturk's ultra-nationalist forces not invaded and conquered the bulk of the 1918 Armenian Republic, which in fact was given to Armenians as a form of reparation to allow that population to rebuild and reconstitute itself in the aftermath of the first phase of genocide. Historian Richard Hovhanessian has estimated that the Armenian Republic today would be a much larger and secure state with a population on the order of 20 million. What would it mean for such an Armenia to face a territorially and demographically smaller Turkey today? Surely Armenians in that republic and around the world would be infinitely more secure and enjoy a level of community well-being that became a fantasy after April 24, 1915. Reparations for the Armenian Genocide are certainly legally, historically, and morally justified in abstract terms. But as the Armenian Republic struggles economically and politically, and the Armenian diaspora expends greater and greater energy to be less and less affected in preserving its Armenian identity, reparations are an absolute need if the Republic and diaspora has any future at all. And the 1915 genocide is not to succeed by 2065. For the current trends make it real possibilities that the state will fail in the next half century and Armenian identity will become a residual and decaying after effect of genocide rather than the vibrant, living community anchor it should be. The full history of the Armenian Genocide is far from written. You can tell I study genocide because I have a pretty pessimistic view of a lot of these things, but I try to be very realistic about the challenges facing post-genocide survival groups. I do not have any time tonight to discuss in detail the reparations proposal made in that report, but I do want to address certain objections that often prevent such work from being taken seriously. First, another false truism is that time heals all wounds. Nothing could be more wrong, unless we mean by healing that perpetrator groups and the world in general eventually can forget about a past genocide when the victim group finally fades away. Unless the harms of a genocide are addressed, then they persist and in fact compound over time, as we've discussed. Second, even setting aside the legal status of Turkey as the Ottoman Empire's continuing state and Turkish Republican forces' perpetration of the second phase of the Armenian Genocide from 1919 to 1923, Turks today do bear responsibility for addressing the harms of the genocide. Let me be clear, they are not in any way to blame for the genocide, even when they deny it. They're culpable for denial, but that's a separate issue. But as their state and society continue to hold the gains made and benefit from them, and Armenians continue to suffer from the material, political, and identity losses sustained, today's Turks have an obligation to repair the damage as much as possible. Of course, nothing approaching full repair is ever possible. No one can bring back the dead, nor can they turn back the clock to erase all the damage done as the harms have compounded for a century to Armenians who have lived and died in that period. But as our report lays out, significant symbolic and material reparations are very possible today. They require only the political and ethical will to make them. Making them is not unfair to present-day Turks. This is not a burden forced on them by Armenians, who should go away quietly instead of making these claims. On the contrary, the burden has been forced on present-day Turks and Armenians by the perpetrators of the genocide, who damned their progeny to the moral taint of genocide for this past century and beyond. However extensive a reparations package is made by Turks today, the burden they assume in giving reparations is the barest tiny fraction of the burden of loss and suffering that genocide still imposes on Armenians. The push for reparations is asking Turks today to shoulder just a small part of that burden borne by Armenians, to share just a part of the unfairness that history has imposed on us all. If this is a sacrifice for Turks today, this is appropriate. Such a sacrifice confirms the true rehabilitation of the Turkish state and society, which were formed in part by the many genocide perpetrators in the Republic's government and military, and which has retained deep within its political culture the same genocidal attitudes towards its past victims as drove the genocide in the first place. Reparations are necessary for the rehabilitation of the Turkish state and society today, as surely many Kurds and those residual Armenian and other minority communities in Turkey can attest. Even a substantial territorial return to the Armenian Republic, which seems to cause an existential crisis for some Turks, is not a ridiculous imposition. How dare many Turks say or think, Armenians demand Turkish land. But that very thought betrays the problem. This land became Turkish through the genocidal ideology that depopulated it of Armenians. Holding that land against what is right means holding on to that genocidal ideology. This is why land reparations are crucial for Turkey's rehabilitation away from this mentality and away from genocide. Another objection is that the quest for reparations, particularly territorial, is a hopeless pipe dream kept alive by deluded so-called Armenian nationalists who refuse to live in reality. Realpolitik is the dominant ethic, such as it is, of international relations, and it leaves no room for moral imperatives toward repair. Armenians are too weak anyway to compel reparations and should focus on what is actually possible. This is just what those who know their power rests on genocide and oppression want us to think. Again and again, victim groups, oppressed groups, and others are told that there is no hope, that they have no power, that realpolitik trumps morality every single time. Why do the powerful say this? Because they know that to hold on to their power in ill-gotten gains, they must convince their victims to believe it. For once victim groups doubt that nothing can change, or believe that nothing can change, nothing will change. We must be thankful that slaves and abolitionists in the US and around the Western world did not believe that the system of slavery of Africans was inevitable and would not fall. Surely countless slaveholders in the US South made this claim in 1855, only to see the end of slavery within the decade. And their descendants said the same thing about segregation, but Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and millions of others refused to believe it and continued pressing until the world did change. Surely Gandhi was told in 1935 that decolonization was a useless pipe dream, and thankfully he refused to bow to such an oppressive reality. Nothing in the world is given, and as much as human history is filled with genocide and oppression, it is filled with the efforts of those who oppose and overcome it. These examples suggest something very important I would like to close with. I have written before about the importance of group reparations for such peoples as Armenians over individual reparations, which do not contribute to the rebuilding and reconstitution of the people as a whole. But now I would like to push myself a bit further. The current reality we live in across the globe is a world order formed through 500 plus years of the forces of aggressive war, colonialism, slavery, apartheid, economic exploitation, mass rape and sexism, and of course, genocide. While setting one instance of such historical wrong right is a step in the right direction, when I talk about reparations, I am not talking about some monetary compensation for some limited loss and going to some limited group or anything like that. Reparations for me is the process of global transformation through which we can finally begin to rework our world away from the structures resulting from genocide and all these other destructive, terrible forces toward a vision in which all human beings have dignity and enough to eat, in which all people can live free from violence and degradation. If the world has taken more than half a millennium to become what it is today, it is clear that that transformation will not happen overnight through some fantasy of revolution. Fortunately, in the last decade, the globe has seen the emergence of a global reparations movement. Jews, Herero, African Americans, Aboriginals, Native Americans from Canada, the United States, and elsewhere, Native South Americans, former comfort women, South African blacks, and a host of other groups have started saying the same kinds of things and pushing more and more together for reparations as the just outcome for all that they've suffered. For me, to take this further, it's when we all see our common problem as one thing that we work on together. that we're actually going to see the transformation that will change the world. Time is not running out for victim communities. Even if Armenians have gone 100 years since the genocide, the Holocaust is 70 years old, Native American groups and African Americans can count their time since what they faced in centuries. Time is really against the perpetrators. With every survivor who dies, with every group that loses its population, that suffers more and more through time, the perpetrators have lost an opportunity to make good against what their group did in the past. For some perpetrators, like Japan, with the comfort women who were pressed into sexual slavery from 1931 to 1945, the time is almost over, and they face a permanent harm that they've done that they can never overcome as the last surviving comfort women near the ends of their lives. Fortunately, for perpetrators like Turkey, national, ethnic, religious, and racial groups have intergenerational existence, and there's still time for them to do what's right. I hope that they will. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. I will now present our second speaker of the night. Dr. Payam Akhavan, Professor of International Law at McGill University and visiting fellow at Kellogg College, Oxford University. He was formerly a UN prosecutor at The Hague, served with the UN in Bosnia, Cambodia, Guatemala, Timor-Leste, and Rwanda, and has appeared as counsel in leading cases before the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court, including the Kony case in Uganda and the Gaddafi case in Libya. He has published extensively, including the article Beyond Impunity, Has International Criminal Justice Prevent Future Atrocities? Selected by the International Library of Law and Legal Theory as one of the most significant published journal essays in contemporary legal studies. His most recent book, Reducing Genocide on Law, Definition, Meaning, and Ultimate Crime, is published by Cambridge University Press. His human rights work has been featured on BBC Hard Talk, The New York Times, BBC Radio's Ideas Program, and Maclean's Magazine. Professor Akhavan has served as counsel in the landmark cases of Akçam versus Turkey and Perenchek versus Switzerland, addressing denial of the Armenian Genocide before the European Court of Human Rights. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Akhavan.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the honor to speak at this evening. I'm also deeply honored to be on the same panel as Professor Theriault and Professor Chuck, dear friend and mentor, and thank you for your kind words, but you profoundly embarrassed me at the same time. And you know, I'm from the Middle East, I'm Iranian by origin, and in my culture, humility is a very important thing, but we have also become masters of pretentious modesty. So my friends would say, don't be humble, you're not that great. So thank you very much for your kind words, and I'm really very privileged to be in your company. Since I've disclosed my ethnic origins, I want to begin perhaps with a story from my Persian folklore of a character known as Mullah Nasreddin, and in Turkish culture he's known as Hoca, and he's a man who's always doing all sorts of silly things, and anyone that is worth anything will have some story or other about Mullah Nasreddin in my culture. And the story is that he had a donkey which his next door neighbor was always borrowing to go to the bazaar, and one day he just became fed up. And when his neighbor approached him and said, may I borrow your donkey to go to the bazaar? Mullah said, I'm so sorry, my donkey just died today. At the exact moment that he says that, his donkey began to bray very loudly. And his neighbor said, oh really? If your donkey is dead, what is that I hear? So Mullah, indignant, looks at his neighbor and says, you fool, do you believe my words or the words of the donkey? So when we talk about truth, perhaps, at a more lofty plane, the truth somehow, even if it comes from a very unseemly source, has a certain power. And that's why, 100 years later, we're gathered here today in Montreal to speak about the denial of truth. And I begin by quoting Jean-Paul Sartre in his book on anti-Semitism, where he said that the Jew exists in the mind of the anti-Semite. If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. When we speak about the problem of the denial of Armenian genocide, it is not just the problem of the Armenians. It is also the problem of Turkish society. And we have to understand that reparation and recognition for this truth isn't just to allow the wounds which still haunt fourth-generation survivors here in Montreal to heal. It is also to allow the Turkish nation to put behind this unfortunate past. I think it is utterly shameful that on April 24th, the Turkish government has held an international conference to commemorate the Battle of Gallipoli. All that the Turkish government is doing is holding the current generation of Turks hostage to what occurred 100 years ago. It is shameful and it is foolish, and it stands in the way of Turkey moving forward, building a better future in a multicultural world founded on respect for human rights. And I want to speak today about why the past continues to haunt the present. Why is it that the question of recognition, beyond its politicization, is really a human rights issue, not just about the Armenian diaspora, not just about the Armenian minority that remains, what little remains of that historic community in Turkey, but how it is equally a problem for Turkish society. I'd like to begin perhaps by telling this story through the number of cases that I've become involved in before the European Court of Human Rights. And just as I describe how these cases reflect different facets of recognition and the process of democratization and respect for human rights in Turkey, I also want to speak about the tremendous opportunities that there are to raise this issue, the issue of moving from prevention to justice before the European Court of Human Rights. Now, for some years, scholars were, I would say, fantasizing about a case brought before the International Court of Justice by Armenia against Turkey under the Genocide Convention. Many professors wrote about this, many conferences were held about it. I will be very blunt. The chances of that case ever happening are zero. It's a question of political reality and a whole host of other legal impediments which I don't need to bother you with. The International Court of Justice, in which only states have standing, in which only Armenia or some other state willing to stand up to Turkey could bring a case, notwithstanding all the other jurisdictional and legal problems which I will not raise, is not going to happen. Let us stop imagining that that is a way of achieving justice. Cases before national courts have been initiated, some of which have successfully claimed, let's say in California, reparations from insurance companies that had denied insurance policies to victims of the Armenian Genocide. But for the most part, it's impossible to bring a case against Turkey before national courts because of the problem of sovereign immunity. Foreign sovereigns are immune from the jurisdiction of national courts. I believe that the most significant front for challenging Turkey on a number of issues which I will discuss today is the European Court of Human Rights, and even before that, Turkey's own courts. We need to bring the struggle back to where it began, within Turkish society, before Turkish courts, in solidarity with the increasing number of courageous Turks that are standing in solidarity with Armenians. Turks that understand that this isn't just about healing the wounds of the Armenians, but it's also about liberating themselves from their own dark past. So I begin with the case of Taner Akçam, a remarkable professor who in 2006 published a remarkable book called A Shameful Act. And here we have a Turk who's writing a book about the Armenian Genocide. And my sort of embrace of the Armenian community here in Canada actually was as a result of a call I received once in 2007 by, among others, my friend Harry Dikranyan and Pierre Akelian and Diran Abedian, my naughty Armenian friends here in Montreal, who asked me whether I would be willing to host an event with Taner Akçam speaking at the law faculty. And of course, as a scholar of genocide studies, I was very happy to do so. And that was really the beginning of a remarkable series of friendships and events, which I think have had very significant consequences. It's interesting that when Taner arrived at Montreal airport, he was detained by the immigration authorities because there had been some sort of terror alert against him. Now, anyone that knows Taner Akçam, who is a very small, huggable, incredibly nice man, it would be like accusing the Teletubbies of being jihadist. Totally lacks credibility. So Taner Akçam was detained and he barely made it on time to this talk at the law faculty. Anyways, that made him even more passionate. He gave a remarkable talk about his book. And this was in early 2007. And it was some months later that we learned about the tragic, shocking assassination of Hrant Dink on the streets of Istanbul. That was really, in many respects, a turning point. For one thing, what was remarkable was the outpouring of solidarity and grief by Turks. 100,000 Turks turned out in the streets of Istanbul with signs saying, "We are all Hrant Dink, we are all Armenians." And it's those openings within Turkish society that is by far the biggest threat to those that want to continue this campaign of denial. It's one thing to have foreign parliaments adopting resolutions recognizing the Armenian Genocide. It's another thing to have the likes of Eli Shafak and Orhan Pamuk, the greatest literary giants of Turkey, standing in solidarity with the Armenian community. So we have to reach out to those allies. We have to recognize their courage, many of whom are receiving death threats and intimidation for the stand that they've taken. It was in honor of Hrant Dink that we decided to take the case of Taner Akçam to the European Court of Human Rights. And the case involved his prosecution and the prosecution of Hrant Dink under Article 301 of the Turkish Penal Code for the crime of insulting Turkishness, which in effect was a hate crime provision in the Penal Code, which suggested that discussing the mass murder of Armenians in 1915 was a hateful act against Turks. And one sees the extraordinary sort of Orwellian inversion of logic and morality to make the victim the perpetrator. So it was because of that conviction that Hrant Dink was gunned down on the streets of Istanbul. We brought the case before the court in order to get a judgment from the European Court of Human Rights, which we succeeded in doing in 2011 after 4 long years and Turkey's attempts to sabotage the case. We received a judgment from the European Court of Human Rights that categorically stated that criminalization of discussion on the Armenian Genocide is a violation of the freedom of speech under the European Convention on Human Rights. And since then, Turkey, to the best of my knowledge, although it has used Article 301 in other contexts to silence others, has not prosecuted anyone specifically for discussing the Armenian Genocide. Whatever we can say about Turkey, there is a certain democratic space which can be exploited. Turkey is a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. It is a member of the Council of Europe. The judgments of the European Court of Human Rights are binding on Turkey. And surprisingly, for the most part, Turkey has complied with judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, even in the payments of reparations, even in cases brought by Armenian foundations that had their properties confiscated, not in 1915, but in more recent times. This brings me to the next case, which recently was heard before the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. So this is in effect, the Court of Appeal, the highest instance of the European Court of Human Rights. And this was the case of Dogu Perenchek versus Switzerland. I'm sure many of you will know about this case. Perenchek had traveled to Lausanne, we understand the significance of Lausanne, in order to, in a very deliberate and provocative way, call the Armenian Genocide an international lie so that he would be prosecuted under the Swiss legislation prohibiting incitement to discrimination and hatred. He was convicted by the Lausanne District Court. That conviction was upheld by the Court of Appeal in Switzerland, after which Dogu Perenchek brought his case before the European Court of Human Rights. And as we know, he prevailed. He prevailed in the European Court of Human Rights in the first instance, which is why the case was appealed to the Grand Chamber. And there is a lesson to be learned in how Perenchek successfully manipulated the obsessive discourse on the genocide issue in order to win his case. And this is something I must say very honestly to my Armenian friends and all those that stand in solidarity with them. We need to be much more strategic, much more sophisticated, and not let this genocide label get in the way of the reality of what happened. Remember that Hrant Dink himself wasn't particularly caught up with the label of genocide. He said that what matters is that there were 1.5 million Armenians in this nation. They've been there for thousands of years, and they are no longer there. That is what matters. Whether we call it genocide, crimes against humanity, aged, catastrophe, that is the reality. And the deniers are successfully using the genocide label as a red herring, as Perenchek did successfully, where he, with very careful legal advice, came before the European Court of Human Rights and says, I don't deny what happened in 1915, but I deny its legal characterization as genocide. And I am a doctor of law. He is. He has a PhD in law from Germany. I'm a doctor of law, and for me, it doesn't make sense to apply a definition which only came into international law in 1948, that's when the Genocide Convention was adopted, to apply it retroactively in 1915. He was very clever, he was very cunning, and he got away with it. What we did on appeal, and before explaining what we did on appeal, I want to mention that I served as counsel for a remarkable coalition of interveners. Now, this was really the initiative of the Institute for Human Rights and Genocide Studies, which is a division of the Zorion Institute, which was acting together with a coalition of Armenian groups, which I think was a remarkable example of the Armenian diaspora and community coming together and taking very seriously the consequences of the deniers exploiting Perenchek's judgment, which merely said that he had the freedom of speech. It did not necessarily say that the genocide did not occur, but of course he exploited this judgment to suggest that, the European Court of Human Rights agrees that the genocide never occurred. So the Armenian community, the organizations that were active on this issue, to their credit, understood the importance of pulling together and making a vigorous case before the European Court. But what is most significant is that the Zorion Institute was joined by the Turkish Human Rights Association. And this is very important because the Turkish Human Rights Association is the oldest and largest human rights NGO in Turkey. It has thousands and thousands of members. And I recognize here, among the many brave Turkish human rights activists, Ishtar Savastar, who is with the Turkish Human Rights Association in Istanbul, who received many, many death threats for having intervened in support of or rather I should say, against Dogu Perenchek. What was the significance of this coalition is that it sent the message to the court that this is not an Armenian issue. It's not just an issue for Armenians, it's also an issue for Turks that want a Turkey that is free from hatred and violence. For those that want to build a multicultural, democratic space, rather than one run by ultra-nationalists such as Doğu Perinçek, that incite hatred against what little remains of the Armenian community as a means of making themselves politically relevant. What is remarkable is that the strategy in this particular case was to steer the court away from the question of whether this did or did not constitute genocide. And I think it's very important to understand the significance of this. Our argument before the court, in effect, is that limitations on freedom of speech include incitement to discrimination and hatred. The issue is not what happened in 1915, what did or did not happen. The issue is, are the statements of Mr. Doğu Perinçek incitement to discrimination and hatred or not? So according to this theory, even if nothing happened in 1915, even if the genocide label is absolutely inapplicable, is irrelevant. The only issue is, did the applicant, in this case Mr. Perinçek, have discriminatory and hateful motives? If his statements taken in context constitute incitement to hatred, then Switzerland properly and permissively limited his freedom of speech. And what was incredibly powerful is that while the Swiss judgment had only made one reference to Perinçek's membership in the Talat Pasha committee, focusing mainly on the statements that he made in Switzerland, it was very clear to us that it's not Armenians in Switzerland that are going to be the main victims of this incitement to hatred. It's the Armenians in Turkey. It's the likes of Hrant Dink. They are the ones that are at the front lines, at the receiving end of this campaign of incitement to hatred. So our focus before the court was to take the court away from Switzerland towards Turkey, to say that the audience for Mr. Perinçek was not Switzerland. The audience was in Turkey, and Lausanne was chosen because of its symbolic importance. But perhaps what I believe was the magic bullet in this particular case were the Turkish lawyers that scoured through the 17,000-page judgment in the Ergenekon trial. 17,000 pages, correct. And who found these incredible gold nuggets where the Istanbul Penal Court, this is not the Armenian diaspora, this is the Istanbul Penal Court, convicting Doğu Perinçek of membership in what it classifies as a terrorist organization, which is linked with the Talat Pasha Committee, which is linked with the murder of Hrant Dink, and the Istanbul Penal Court specifically states in its judgment that Mr. Perinçek was in charge of psychological war, and that his main instrument was denial of the Armenian genocide. This is the Istanbul Penal Court saying this. So we simply reproduced the relevant parts of the judgment, which made it exceedingly embarrassing for the Turkish government to have intervened on behalf of a man that its own courts convicted to life imprisonment for being a member of a terrorist organization that is inciting hatred. Now we know that Perinçek was ultimately released on some absurd technicality because of the change in the political fortunes of the Erdogan government, resulting in a rapprochement between erstwhile enemies, and Doğu Perinçek was allowed to travel to Strasbourg for this hearing, which actually was very helpful. Because when he stood up in court and began his rant about how Talat Pasha was a great humanist, that is all that the members of the court needed to see. So all this to say that we have to await and see what the judgment of the court will be, but I think there are powerful lessons to be learned there about the whole discourse of is it genocide or is not genocide, of reducing the enormity of everything that has happened from 1915 until today to a single label, rather than understanding the intimate reality. It is said that victims are not statistics, and neither are they labels. Victims have names, they have a universe of human relations and realities, and I believe that we need to make that the discourse rather than the genocide label. And we need, in particular, to look at the Armenians, which are the last remnants of that historical community in Turkey, and show how this is not about an abstract historical dispute, it's about incitement to hatred, it's also about the future of Turkey and Armenia. I will end by speaking about two projects that I think the Armenian community and their friends have to think about very seriously. One of those was referred to in the introduction. It's the case of Kasab. Someone doesn't like me. Under the European Convention on Human Rights, the convention has extraterritorial application where a party to the convention is implicated in human rights abuses beyond its own borders. There is evidence that when al-Nusra captured Kasab and began to desecrate the Armenian church there, that the Turkish forces were actually shelling Kasab with artillery, which resulted in death and injury to civilians. So there is a case, yet another case to be brought before the European Court of Human Rights if we want justice, to hold Turkey's feet to the fire. Finally, I want to end by speaking about the case of Aksu versus Turkey, in which a gypsy who was a Turkish citizen brought the case before the court about the stereotyping of gypsies in Turkish educational curricula. And the judgment in that court held that indeed stereotypical or hateful depictions of groups would be in violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. So let's think about the Turkish school curriculum. What does the Turkish school curriculum tell every single Turkish child? Which is the root, the very root of the denialist policy, begins with what Turkish children are being taught in the school. That is the front line of the war against denial. What is every Turkish child being told? They're being told that Armenians were traitors, Armenians were disloyal, and they got what they deserved. That is what every Turkish child learns. One of the reports that I came across spoke about how a film which showed Armenian massacres of innocent Turkish civilians in very graphic imagery was being shown to traumatized children across Turkey. That is where the next case against Turkey has to come, to challenge the curriculum which is being taught to Turkish children as a violation of human rights. And I will end by referring to what the Supreme Court of Canada said in upholding the constitutional validity of Canada's hate speech legislation. The Supreme Court said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. These are the chilling facts of history. And if the hatred began with words in 1915, then it's for us to take those same words and speak truth to power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Akhavan. I will now present our third speaker, which is Dr. Chalk. Dr. Frank Chalk is Professor of History and Director of the Montreal Institute of Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University. He is a past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and the Canadian Association for African Studies. Professor Chalk has been fellow of the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C., and Fulbright Professor at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. Mobilizing the will to intervene, leadership to prevent mass atrocities, co-authored with Romeo Dallaire, Carl Matthews, and others, was published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2010. Professor Chalk has participated in training missions in Kyrgyzstan, Uganda, and Poland for the Office of the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. In May 2012, he was appointed a member of the Canadian Advisory Council of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. In November 2012, on the nomination of Senator Romeo Dallaire, the Governor General of Canada awarded Professor Chalk the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of his work on genocide. In February 2013, Dr. Chalk was appointed a Fellow of the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability at Concordia. In 2015, his university honored him by naming him a Great Concordian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chalk.
I thought very hard about what I could bring to the table or the lectern tonight, because the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide is an opportunity, a window of opportunity, not only for the Armenian people in the diaspora and in Armenia, but for all of us who care about human rights and ending the scourge of genocide, or at least reducing the incidence of crimes against humanity and genocide. I'm feeling instructed by the previous speakers and Payam speaking about the tradition of humility, which I will never forget. And also the contribution from the floor by Siri. I don't know if all of you heard it, but up front it was very clear that Siri was commenting as Professor Akhavan was speaking. And Siri said, "I'm not sure what you said was clear, but I thought it was very clear." So I think we've learned, among other things, that Siri is not a reliable guide. So those of you who already thought that it was, I'm sorry to disillusion you. I'm very tempted to turn this off so we don't get all this echo stuff, because there's a lot of electronic stuff, probably some in my pocket too. I'll leave it on and we'll see how it goes. I could speak so you could hear me at the back without the mic, but if are you recording this, or? Oh, that's why you want the mic. Okay. All right, then we'll go ahead with the microphone. It's not easy to teach the history and sociology of genocide. Thank goodness. I don't mean that it's challenging and difficult psychologically. I think all of us recognize that it is, but that isn't insurmountable by far. There are much worse things that people do and overcome. It's particularly difficult right now because more and more scholars are devoting their attention to the problem of genocide. And there's an explosion of publications with very interesting insights and new evidence and new arguments. And frankly, it's very difficult to keep up. There's just a flood of material. Somebody characterized the social media and monitoring the social media as being like drinking water from a fire hose. And sometimes I feel like that as I pick up the wonderful journals we have, the Journal of Genocide Research, and Genocide Studies and Prevention, and Genocide International, etc. We have 3 great journals, and then we also have something I always dreamed of that's happening. It's fantastic. The American Historical Review, the most important historical journal for English-speaking historians, has in the last 2 or 3 years published 4 or 5 major articles on different facets of genocide. And frankly, when we were discussing the kinds of journals that needed to be published in genocide studies, I was one of those who said, our real goal must be raising our scholarship to such a high level that the very best journals, the best journal in each of the major fields, sociology, history, political science, philosophy, etc., will publish our articles. And we will no longer need the protected enclave of genocide studies journals, except for our own information, staying in touch with each other's work. But we'll be able to look at the best journal in each field and find fantastic scholarship. And of course, we translate that onto the world stage. Beyond the world of scholarship, what we really dream of is a situation in which the United Nations is the institution that we know it could become. And that premier institution will live up to its potential and create the kind of framework and architecture of interests and values that will discourage national leaders, militia leaders, regime leaders from committing mass atrocity crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity. We're a long way from that place. I want to talk with you this evening, and this is more a discussion, I hope you'll join me in it, than a lecture, about how we got where we are, and particularly the Armenian Genocide perpetrators in impunity immediately following the genocide of 1915 and its genocidal consequences for the 20th century. So I'm trying here to look at the nexus between the acts of genocide and the development and evolution of international criminal law and the palpable, measurable consequences of impunity. I'm not going to argue that accountability and impunity by themselves could ever end or diminish genocides, just by themselves. Because we need to recognize that genocides take place in a real world in which the perpetrators are not students of international criminal law and often have very selfish and security and other interests at heart. But we can and have, and Payam could give you a great lecture on all the cases from Yugoslavia and elsewhere in which the fear of prosecution under international and domestic law has discouraged perpetrators and stopped them in their tracks. And we need to know more about those cases to inspire us and also our governments and our leaders in ensuring that there are more such cases in the future. I want to start with a scholar that some of you may know. Her name is Michelle Toussaint, and she's a professor of history at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, which I think is somehow quite appropriate. Las Vegas as a center of scholarship. It's a gamble, right? And she's writing about the recent literature that looks at humanitarianism, genocide, and liberalism. Because there's a tidal wave in university professorial scholarship that has emerged in which the paramount idea is that the responsibility to protect, genocide prevention, etc., are really legacies of a rather sullied past, a kind of dirty little secret about where humanitarian law and criminal law aimed at preventing genocide first took seed, or took root, I should say. Professor Toussaint is not herself part of that school, but she is a student who brings to the table what those scholars who believe that anti-genocide work has its roots in some pretty bad themes in history are coming from. They point to the influence of 19th century humanitarianism, having roots in strident evangelicalism and moralizing liberalism, as one of the important roots of opposition to the massacre of Armenian Christians in the Ottoman Empire from the 1870s to 1920. And although they support the attempts to prevent the massacre of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and others, they privilege something else that was going on at the same time. They see, parallel to humanitarianism, the British Empire emerging as a major violator of human rights through its practice of colonialism and imperialism. And so they argue, the British Empire sought to shore up its political and financial interests, first by exercising informal influence over the Ottoman Empire through a network of consular and diplomatic outposts, and after World War I and the Armenian Genocide. They allege that Britain pursued its own ends in the Middle East, quote, under the guise of internationalism, by casting the British Empire as the best instrument for protecting civilians around the world. And so they take advantage in their argument of the fact that Britain allegedly positioned itself, and I quote, as the enforcer of what can be considered the precursor of international law and treaties that bound Europe to a common set of international principles, unquote. But not because Britain was genuinely committed to humanitarian values, but rather because Britain sought to conceal that it was pursuing its own national interests. And in doing so, it was simply using the desire, the public desire, to bring to justice initially in 1919 the Turkish perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide as a cloak beneath which to pursue its own narrow economic interests. Now, this idea, colonialism and imperialism, took up the values of humanitarianism largely as an instrument of concealment behind which to do more evil things. Is, I think, very important in the literature today. Some of its advocates cite the work of Hannah Arendt and Zygmunt Bauman and others to justify the analysis that today's advocates of preventing genocide may very well be dupes or may be even in league with those who are still pursuing what they would now call neoliberal goals, which is not a good thing if you know where they're coming from. I remember students in my genocide classes in the early 80s and 90s who raised this question in a different form. Many of them were actually among the few Armenian students in the class who asked the question, why did Britain not do more to fully realize the trial of the perpetrators of the 1915 genocide? Why did Britain abandon the courtroom? Why did Britain permit the trials to collapse after a few convictions? Why did it not prosecute many of the perpetrators who were imprisoned on Malta and elsewhere by the British forces? And the fact is that Britain did not do very much. It did worse than not doing very much. Britain, in fact, did abandon the cause of justice for the victims of the Armenian Genocide. And we know quite a bit about why it did that from the diplomatic and other records of the British government. For one thing, Britain brought home tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops who'd been stationed either in Turkey or on its borders, and left behind a very small number of troops who were in no position to then wage war against Kemal Ataturk's forces as they rose. For another thing, like the United States, the British government strongly supported the acquisition of oil concessions in what they called the Near East, which included many parts of the old Ottoman Empire. And they sought to build petroleum-fueled navies that would operate on the basis of these oil reserves that Standard Oil and other oil companies, Shell, British Petroleum, etc., acquired. And they needed to negotiate with the very Turkish government and some of its supporters in the region who possessed legal title to those lands under which the oil sat. And so they didn't want to offend them, and they were under enormous pressure to abandon the whole issue. Third, some of the Turkish nationalists were very clever and kidnapped the nephew of a senior British colonial official, and very much in the spirit of some of the modern terrorist groups, said they would murder this nephew unless the British abandoned prosecution of the Turkish officers and political leaders who were in their custody, which furnished a ready out, an easy way out for the British government. The French government was no better. Many of the Allied governments were in the race to control oil, and as a result, we know that the prosecutions were not developed the way they could have been, either by the Turkish prosecutors serving a government that was soon overthrown and replaced by Kemal Atatürk, and as Taner Akçam has shown, a government which soon put in positions of great authority some of the very perpetrators of the genocide of 1915, who might well have been indicted and convicted if the original trials had been pursued. And now let's move forward a little bit in time and look at the League of Nations very briefly. The League of Nations, like the United Nations today, was a club of nations. That's both good and bad. It's good because it creates the enormous potential for the development of a consensus around the idea of issues like genocide prevention. But it's bad in the sense that the narrow interests of nations and the horse trading among nations is a very powerful force that limits the United Nations' reach, and also means that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have the opportunity to retain their own monopoly of military power, ensuring that the Security Council and the United Nations does not to this day possess an independent military force. And we know why that's the case. It's not just the Russians and the Chinese. The British, the French, and the Americans are strikingly, vigorously opposed to the development of a United Nations military force and anything that even resembles the seed of a United Nations international force. Because they want freedom of action and they don't want to have another force in the field that might interfere with their operations. And this is not a consequence of capitalism, socialism. It's not a consequence of imperialism. It's a consequence of national interests and a certain kind of nationalism, a view that our hands must never be stayed by others. Now, the League of Nations was not absent from the field of Armenian issues. I won't go through all the treaties. Many of you here know all about the Treaty of Sèvres and other treaties and what happened to them. But you may not know, unless you've read an article in the American Historical Review by Professor Keith David Wattenpaugh, W-A-T-N-P-A-U-G-H, in December 2010, about the League of Nations' role in the rescue of some 2,000 Armenian orphans from orphanages in Aleppo and elsewhere in Syria. And Professor Wattenpaugh found in Geneva a virtually complete set of the documents pertaining over several years, from 1920 to 27, of the return of these orphans who in many cases had liberated themselves to their families or to more hospitable countries. And the League of Nations played a major role in achieving this. And he argues that this was one of the roots of the birth of humanitarianism in the 20th century. The League did a good job. They did the sort of work that was done at the end of World War II. Ted could tell us a great deal about that. At the end of the war, when UNRWA and other UN agencies and international committees were formed, and Holocaust survivors, after many years of struggle, were able to relocate thanks to some of these programs. Now let's go on to Germany in 1933 for a moment. What were the events that shaped the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler that emerged in the international arena of the 20s and 30s? What preceded the rise of Hitler that made a real difference in how Hitler was perceived by other national leaders in North America, Europe, and elsewhere? Let me give you a short list of what I think are the most important events and their significance. First of all, the slaughter of the trenches in World War I, which was unprecedented in international warfare in the memory of those who lived at the time. And second, the disillusionment that followed the signing of the Versailles Treaty, as Wilson's 14 points, which were cast in a very idealistic way, as bringing an end to war for all time and realizing the principles of democracy and humanitarianism in world affairs, suddenly turned out to be part of a peace treaty that was the very opposite of promoting democracy and promoting an end to war and imperialism. In fact, the gains of imperialism were crystallized and protected in the Versailles Treaty and the treaty with Austria, the Treaty of Trianon. The Russian Civil War and the Western intervention in the Russian Civil War, one of the bloodiest struggles in history, ranking very close to the American Civil War, which was extremely bloody. And with it, the notion that capitalist countries, imperialist countries had banded together to crush the Bolshevik Revolution and had done very little to support those democratic elements that preceded the Bolshevik Revolution, and to ensure that Russia moved from autocracy to something closer to a liberal democracy, but rather had abandoned democrats in Russia and attempted to impose supporters of the Tsar, or even worse, on the Russian people. Under Stalin and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the famine in Ukraine of the early 1930s, which in my view was created by the Soviet state with malice and forethought and intent to destroy a portion of the Ukrainian people, to send a message to the surviving Ukrainians and the other nationalities in the Soviet Union that there was no future in seeking any kind of national identity any longer beyond what the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would accept. And this coming from a party which, in the days of Lenin and the early days of Stalin, had promoted the Ukrainian language and made it the official language of the schools in Ukraine, and had promoted other national minorities, leading not only to the famine, but also to the annihilation of the leadership of the Ukrainian Communist Party, the Armenian Party, and all the other national groups within the Soviet Union. So that, in the end, one Georgian held in his hands, you might say, the fate of all the other minorities and majorities inside the Soviet Union. Now, it's against that background that Hitler could claim that he was the savior of the German people and the Aryan race. I think we need to answer the question, where did the xenophobic nationalism and racism of the Nazis find validation in the minds of the Nazi leadership, and to some extent also in the minds of a significant portion of the German people of the 1930s? The answer, the best answer I have found, and it's not in the mainstream literature, unfortunately, is that offered by Gunnar Heinzen, a scholar who studies genocide, and has studied it, and works in Germany, who argues that Hitler's great grievance against the Jewish people arose from his view that the Jewish people had imposed on Christendom and on the rest of the world the Ten Commandments, which eliminated any possibility of enforcing the Darwinian struggle for survival that would produce a stronger race of superior people. And Hitler literally went back to the fact that under the Ten Commandments, the Jewish people abandoned and condemned infanticide and the murder of weak children by exposing them to the elements, which had been done from time immemorial and is well known in the history of Carthage, for example, had, in Hitler's view, corrupted Christianity. The whole notion that thou shalt not kill innocents eliminated the possibility of building up a strong Aryan people who would have to do what Hitler tried to do in 1939-1940, which is eliminate first 75,000 physically and mentally challenged young people and elderly, and then eventually 175,000 by the end of the war in 1945, simply for the crime of having intellectual challenges or physical challenges that could not be repaired. This was just as important in Hitler's mind as the destruction of the Jewish people became, because he identified the Jewish people and the destruction of the physically and mentally challenged as one and the same thing. And here I accept Henry Friedlander's argument. This is his argument, which I think is extremely important. Norman Cohn, another historian, in several of his books, The Pursuit of the Millennium and Europe's Inner Demons, and his book Warrant for Genocide, pointed to what we now recognize is the ultimate goal, the ultimate motive of many, many perpetrators of genocide. And that is the belief that it is possible to build a perfect society on the face of the earth in our own time. It's a kind of apocalyptic and millenarian view integrated into secular politics, and it's undertaken with religious zeal, the zeal of new converts to a new religion. And in fact, it helps to explain how it was that the Nazis not only sought to destroy Jews, Sinti, and Roma, but other peoples as well, and that Himmler believed the destruction of the Slavs, for example, through enslavement and harsh labor conditions, was a genuinely principled and valuable thing to do, because the Slavs were also regarded as inferior. Now, today, I'm asking the question, what were the consequences of the failure to pursue the criminals who perpetrated the Armenian Genocide by the British, the French, the Americans, and others after 1919, 1920? I would say that the chief consequence was the reinforcement of the racism, extreme nationalism, and xenophobia which characterized the rest of the 20th century. Menis Midlarsky, in his new book, The Origins of Political Extremism, Mass Violence in the 20th Century and Beyond, which was published about 3 years ago, tries to assess the commonalities among communism, fascism, Islamic radicalism, and extreme nationalism. They are anti-pluralist to the core. They believe all individuals have to follow in lockstep the prevailing ideology, and enemies, current, imagined, or potential, have to be purged, destroyed physically in one fashion or another. What is it that has brought these movements to such a radical and extreme view? It is, among other things, the belief that they were humiliated as a people through defeat in war or defeat in the culture battles in which they are engaged. And second, the loss of territory, which often was part of those, or a result of those military defeats. And thus, as Tanar Akçam has pointed out, and others have pointed out about the Armenian Genocide, the fact that the Ottoman Empire was subverted or eroded from within by the rebellions and revolutions of many of its Christian inhabitants who had been oppressed for many centuries. And finally it had enough, starting with the Greeks in the 19th century and moving on at the end of the 19th century to many other peoples. And that refugees who identified themselves finally as Turkish returned to the Turkish nation as it existed in 1909 and earlier, and then the years just after 1909, contributed significantly to the extremism of the Committee of Union and Progress in its worst form, the form it evolved into. And we know that many of the ideologists of the Committee of Union and Progress were themselves either coming from the eastern states that were not even part of the Ottoman Empire, but had become part of other lands but had retained the Turkish language and then come back when the Committee of Union and Progress was being formed, or came from the West, from those parts of the old Ottoman Empire, including Serbia, etc., from which they were expelled, finding Armenians enjoying a measure of equality in the early years of the 20th century and a measure of prosperity. They sought the property, the land, and to rob the dignity of the Armenian people, which they felt they had lost. Now, all of this could have been changed, and might have been changed, seriously, had the perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide been prosecuted to the full limit of the existing laws of the time, under Turkish law, for the crimes they committed, whether it was first-degree murder or other crimes, without even creating the notion of crimes against humanity, which has its roots, among other things, in what happened in 1915, as well as some earlier events. And yet, by not doing that, the Turkish people were left with a narrative crafted by the very people who perpetrated the genocide. So I would say that today, when we consider the significance of the work we do under the terms of the responsibility to protect and its principles, under the terms of the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court, and the domestic laws of our own countries that have domesticated the UN Genocide Convention and the Rome Statutes with that. What we are really talking about is one of the most important instruments available for preventing future genocide, if they are pursued to the limits of the law and our own will. And if we ever falter in that work, let's remember what I think were these consequences of the failure to prosecute the perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide. They include the slaughter Stalin perpetrated against Ukrainians and other nationalities and groups that even had invented identities that didn't really exist, except people were murdered under those definitions. The Holocaust itself, and right on through to the Rwanda genocide, when the assigned identity of Tutsi was a lethal classification simply because people believed that they had to destroy every member of the group in order to achieve a perfect future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've been told that I have to finalize this event. In the name of the organizing committee, I want to thank Professor Payam Akhavan, Professor Theriault, and Professor Frank Chalk for accepting our invitation. With such professors, we are sure that the truth will be unveiled. I want to also thank our sponsors, the Assyrian Chaldean Syriac Student Union of Canada, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, Rwanda, the Montreal Holocaust Memorial Center, STAN Canada, Amnesty International, Sarah Corning Center for Genocide Education, Ukrainian Student Association, and Greek Student Association. I want to also thank Mr. Ted and Mrs. Leontine for the very powerful words that we had today. A special thanks to the Armenian Student Associations of the three universities in Montreal and Armenian Student Association for their hard work and support. If you want to support the Armenian Genocide Centennial Committee of Canada, and if you want to participate in similar events, please visit the website fightgenocide.ca to donate. We need your support. Every dollar counts. It only takes 2 minutes of your time. Also, for information about our work for the Centennial, please visit genocidecentennial.ca. I want to remind you that we will be in Ottawa on April 24th for our yearly protest. And on May 3rd, we have organized a big march for prevention in downtown Montreal. Meet us at 2 p.m. in Westmount Park. Hope to see you all there. Thank you for attending.